in the quiet suburbs of North London, stands a seemingly ordinary council house at number 284 Green Street. During the late summer of 1977, this unassuming semi-detached residence became the epicenter of the most well-documented paranormal activity in British history. The events that unfolded within these walls did not merely whisper in the night, but screamed with a ferocity that shook the nation to its core. Neighbors and seasoned police officers alike witnessed phenomena that defied all logical explanation and challenged their understanding of reality. This was not a fleeting ghost story told to frighten children, but a relentless siege upon a working-class family. The terror that gripped the Hodgson family remains a chilling testament to the unknown forces that dwell just beyond the veil of our perception. The year was 1977, and the United Kingdom was in the midst of cultural shifts and economic uncertainty. In the borough of Enfield, life moved at a steady and predictable pace for Peggy Hodgson and her 4 children. Peggy was a single mother doing her best to raise Margaret, Janet, Johnny, and Billy in a modest home filled with the typical clutter of family life. The atmosphere in the house was usually one of chaotic warmth, but a subtle shift began to permeate the air as August drew to a close. There was a heaviness that settled in the corners of the rooms, and a stillness that felt unnatural. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for a dark signal to unleash the chaos that was brewing beneath the floorboards. It began on the evening of August 31st in a manner that seemed almost innocuous at first. Janet Hodgson, aged 11, and her brother Johnny, aged 10, were in their bedroom preparing for sleep when they heard a shuffling noise. It sounded like feet dragging across the floorboards, but no one else was in the room. They alerted their mother, who initially dismissed it as the creaking of an old house settling for the night. However, the sounds persisted and grew in volume, shifting from shuffling to a distinct rhythmic knocking that seemed to travel through the walls. Peggy Hodgson entered the room to reprimand the children, but froze when she witnessed a heavy chest of drawers slide slowly across the floor away from the wall without any human assistance. Panic surged through Peggy Hodgson as she attempted to push the heavy oak furniture back into its place. To her horror, an invisible force shoved back with equal strength, refusing to let the dresser return to its original position. The air in the room turned frigid, and the knocking sounds escalated into violent bangs that shook the entire structure of the house. Fearing for the safety of her children, Peggy gathered them up and fled to the house of her neighbors Vic and Peggy Nottingham. The Nottinghams were large and practical people who were not easily frightened. But upon entering the Hodgson home to investigate, they too heard the heavy rhythmic pounding that echoed from the empty bedrooms upstairs. Desperate for assistance, and lacking any other recourse, the family called the local police station. Constable Carolyn Heaps arrived at the scene, expecting a case of vandalism or a domestic disturbance. What she encountered defied her training and left her trembling with disbelief. While standing in the living room, Constable Heaps witnessed a dining chair levitate off the floor and slide several feet across the room before coming to rest. She checked for wires and hidden mechanisms, but found absolutely nothing. In her official police log, she wrote that she saw a chair move, but could not determine the cause. This police report became one of the most significant pieces of evidence, verifying the early activity at the Enfield house. The events of that night were merely the opening salvo in a campaign of terror that would last for 18 grueling months. The poltergeist activity escalated, rapidly moving from sliding furniture to flying objects. Marbles and Lego bricks would materialize out of thin air and fly across the room with the velocity of bullets. The items were often hot to the touch, suggesting a manipulation of energy that physics could not explain. The family lived in a state of perpetual siege, sleeping in the same room with the lights on, terrified to be alone. The story soon leaked to the press, and the Daily Mirror sent a photographer and a reporter to document the claims. The media frenzy that ensued brought the case to the attention of the Society for Psychical Research. Morris Gross was a calm and rational inventor who had joined the Society for Psychical Research following a personal tragedy. His own daughter, named Janet, had died in a motorcycle accident, and he was searching for proof of life after death. He arrived at Green Street, expecting to debunk a hoax, but quickly found himself in the middle of a paranormal war zone. Gross spent countless nights in the house documenting the phenomena. He witnessed doors opening and closing on their own, heard footsteps in empty rooms, and felt the temperature drop drastically in specific spots. He became a father figure to the Hodgson children, particularly young Janet, who seemed to be the primary focus of the entity. As the investigation deepened, Morris Gross was joined by the writer and researcher Guy Lyon Playfair. Together, they compiled a massive amount of data, including tape recordings and photographs. The entity seemed to display a rudimentary intelligence, responding to questions with knocks. 1 knock for no and 2 knocks for yes became the standard method of communication. Through these sessions, the entity revealed that it was not a single spirit, but a multitude of voices vying for attention. The most dominant personality claimed to be a man who had died in the house years prior. The atmosphere was thick with malice, and the investigators often felt physically drained after spending just a few hours inside the suffocating walls of the Green Street home. The physical attacks on 11-year-old Janet Hodgson became increasingly violent and disturbing. She was often thrown out of her bed by unseen hands, or dragged across the floor while screaming for help. Photographers captured chilling images of Janet levitating high in the air, her body contorted in unnatural positions. Skeptics argued that she was merely jumping, but the trajectory and the force required to launch her across the room defied the physics of a simple jump. In some instances, she appeared to be asleep or in a trance while her body floated above the mattress. The terror in her eyes when she awoke was palpable and impossible to feign for a child of her age. One of the most terrifying aspects of the haunting was the manifestation of the voice. Janet would fall into a deep trance, and a guttural rasping voice would emerge from her throat. This voice did not belong to a young girl. It was the voice of an old man, harsh and filled with vitriol. The voice identified itself as Bill Wilkins. It spoke of dying in a chair in the corner of the living room, describing a hemorrhage and the sensation of going blind before death. The researchers recorded hours of these conversations, analyzing the vocal patterns. A speech therapist later confirmed that the voice was using the false vocal cords, a feat that would be incredibly painful and nearly impossible for an 11-year-old girl to sustain for hours on end. The claim made by the voice was eventually investigated by the research team. They discovered that a man named Bill Wilkins had indeed lived in the house before the Hodgsons and had died exactly as the voice described. His son was located and confirmed the details of his father's death, including the specific chair he died in and the medical cause. This revelation sent a shockwave through the investigation. How could young Janet Hodgson know the intimate details of the death of a man she had never met and whose history was not public knowledge? The skepticism began to wane among those who were close to the case as the evidence of genuine possession mounted. The activity in the house was not limited to the night. It occurred in broad daylight, often in front of multiple witnesses. Objects would vanish from one room and reappear in another, or drop from the ceiling. A heavy cast iron fireplace was ripped from the wall in the upstairs bedroom, exposing the brickwork behind it. Such a feat would require immense physical strength. Yet it happened while the children were under observation. The sheer destructive power of the poltergeist was terrifying. It seemed intent on dismantling the house piece by piece, creating an environment of chaos and destruction that mirrored the internal turmoil of the terrified family. Curtains would twist themselves into tight ropes, appearing to try and strangle anyone who came too close. On one occasion, Morris Gross was investigating a noise when a piece of machinery flew past his head, missing him by inches. The entity seemed to enjoy taunting the investigators, playing a cat and mouse game that tested their resolve. It would often go quiet when cameras were set up, only to erupt in violence the moment the equipment was turned off. This elusive behavior fueled the arguments of skeptics who claimed the children were orchestrating the events. But the sheer volume of incidents made a comprehensive hoax highly unlikely. The toll on Peggy Hodgson was immense. She was a mother watching her children being tormented by forces she could not fight. Her health deteriorated, and her nerves were frayed to the breaking point. The neighbors offered support, but many were too afraid to enter the house. The family became pariahs in their own community, with some accusing them of seeking fame or attention. However, they made no money from the story, and their lives were effectively ruined by the intrusion. Peggy constantly sought help from priests, mediums, and doctors, but nothing seemed to permanently banish the presence. The entity was relentless, feeding off the fear and anxiety it created. There were moments of respite where the activity would cease for days, giving the family a false sense of hope. During these calm periods, they would try to return to a normal routine, only for the poltergeist to return with renewed vigor. It was a psychological torture designed to break their spirits. One night, the bedclothes were ripped off the children, and invisible hands pinched and slapped them, leaving red welts on their skin. The physical evidence of the assaults was documented by the investigators, who were helpless to stop the attacks. They could only observe and record the suffering of the family. The media circus surrounding the house drew attention from around the world. Famous demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren visited the Enfield house briefly during the height of the activity. They concluded that the family was under attack by demonic forces rather than a human spirit. While their involvement was brief compared to Gross and Playfair, it highlighted the international significance of the case. The idea that a demon could infest a council house in London terrified the public. It brought the supernatural into the mundane domestic sphere, proving that no one was safe within their own home. Skeptics such as Anita Gregory from the Society for Psychical Research were determined to prove the case was a fraud. She caught Janet bending spoons and hiding them, and used this to discredit the entire investigation. Janet later admitted that she did fake a small percentage of the phenomena to see if the investigators would catch her, stating that the pressure to perform was overwhelming. However, Gross and Playfair argued that a few instances of childish trickery did not explain the thousands of unexplained events witnessed by police officers and independent observers. The mixture of genuine phenomena and fabrication added a complex layer to the case. The curtain incident remains one of the most chilling visual accounts. A heavy curtain near Janet's bed wound itself around her neck in a tight spiral. Her mother had to use significant force to untangle the fabric, which seemed to be animated by a life of its own. If Peggy had not been present, the constriction could have been fatal. This escalation to life-threatening physical violence marked a turning point. The entity was no longer just making noise or moving furniture. it was actively trying to harm the children. The fear in the house shifted from anxiety to mortal dread. Gas fireplaces were a common feature in homes of that era, and the poltergeist manipulated them dangerously. In one instance, the heavy metal grill of the gas fire was wrenched from its setting. In another, papers and clothes would spontaneously ignite. The danger of fire in a terraced house was catastrophic. The family had to remain vigilant at all times, unable to relax even for a moment. The psychological strain of constant vigilance wore them down, leaving them exhausted and vulnerable to the emotional manipulation of the entity. As 1978 dragged on, the activity showed no signs of stopping. The recordings of the voice became more complex, with Bill Wilkins engaging in long, rambling conversations. He spoke of his life, his family, and his confusion about his state of being. Sometimes other voices would interject, barking like dogs or whistling. The cacophony of sounds was disorienting. Researchers tried to find a reason for the haunting, linking it to the onset of puberty in the girls. But the violence of the phenomena seemed to exceed the typical poltergeist profile associated with adolescent energy. The family attempted to have the house blessed multiple times. Priests would come and sprinkle holy water, reciting prayers of deliverance. The activity would often subside briefly, only to return with a vengeance as soon as the holy men left. It seemed the entity mocked these religious interventions. During one visit, a priest's car was damaged by an unseen force while it was parked outside. The message was clear. The entity claimed dominion over the property and would not be easily evicted by traditional rites. Janet was eventually sent away to a hospital for a period of observation to undergo physical and psychiatric testing. During her absence, the activity in the house on Green Street decreased significantly, though it did not stop entirely. Doctors found no physical or mental abnormalities that could explain the voice or the seizures she appeared to experience. She was pronounced sane and healthy, which only deepened the mystery. If she was not mentally ill and not physically capable of producing the voice, then the paranormal explanation remained the most viable option. Upon Janet's return, the chaos resumed, but slowly began to lose its intensity over the following year. The violent outbursts became less frequent, and the furniture ceased to fly across the room. It was as if the energy that fueled the poltergeist was slowly dissipating, or the entity was losing its grip on the family. By 1979, the haunting had largely subsided, leaving behind a traumatized family and a house that would forever be marked by the events. The silence that returned to Green Street was almost as unsettling as the noise had been. The legacy of the Enfield Poltergeist followed the family for the rest of their lives. Johnny Hodgson died young of cancer, and Peggy Hodgson passed away in the very house where the terror took place. Janet left home as soon as she could, seeking a life of anonymity, away from the cameras and the questions. She has maintained throughout the decades that the events were real and that the trauma she endured was genuine. The scars of those 18 months ran deep, affecting her relationships and her sense of security in the world. The house at 284 Green Street was eventually rented to other families. Subsequent tenants reported feeling watched and experiencing a pervasive sense of unease, though nothing compared to the violence of the late 70s. The notoriety of the address made it a destination for thrill seekers and ghost hunters, ensuring that the family could never truly escape the shadow of the past. The walls had absorbed the fear and the energy of the encounter, leaving a residual imprint that sensitive individuals could still detect years later. Maurice Gross remained a staunch defender of the case until his death. He believed, without a doubt, that he had witnessed genuine paranormal activity and that he had communicated with the spirit of Bill Wilkins. The tapes he recorded remain some of the most disturbing audio evidence in the field of parapsychology. The guttural voice of Bill Wilkins describing his death is a sound that haunts the nightmares of those who listen to it. It stands as a stark reminder that death may not be the end of consciousness or the end of suffering. The debate regarding the Enfield Poltergeist continues to this day, dividing the paranormal community. Skeptics point to the admitted fakery and the chaotic environment as proof of a hoax, while believers cite the police reports and the sheer number of witnesses as irrefutable evidence. It remains the most investigated case of its kind, providing a wealth of data, but few concrete answers. The ambiguity of the case is perhaps its most terrifying aspect. It forces us to confront the possibility that reality is not as stable as we believe it to be. What happened in Enfield was a perfect storm of adolescent energy, repressed emotion, and perhaps a genuine intrusion from the other side. It stripped away the illusion of safety that we associate with our homes. The idea that an ordinary family in an ordinary house could be targeted by such a malevolent force is a deeply unsettling thought. It suggests that the barrier between our world and the next is thinner than we dare to imagine, and that sometimes things can step through. Even now, decades later, the recordings of the Enfield voice send shivers down the spine. The images of Janet levitating and the stories of furniture moving on its own have become part of modern folklore. The story has been adapted into films and television series, cementing its place in the cultural consciousness. But for the Hodgson family, it was not entertainment. It was a terrifying ordeal that stole their childhood and shattered their peace. The horror they experienced was visceral and real, leaving wounds that time could never fully heal. As we look back on the events at Green Street, a lingering dread remains. The entity identified as Bill Wilkins claimed to be trapped, confused, and angry. If his spirit was indeed bound to that house, one must wonder if he is still there waiting in the shadows. The house stands quiet now, but the history remains etched into its foundation. The Enfield Poltergeist serves as a grim reminder that there are forces in this world that we do not understand, and that sometimes the dark corners of our homes hide more than just dust. The true horror of the Enfield Poltergeist lies not just in the flying objects or the demonic voices, but in the isolation of the victims. A family trapped in a fishbowl of terror, watched by the world, but helped by no one. They were alone with a monster that lived in their walls. It is a story of endurance against the impossible. As the sun sets over Enfield and the shadows lengthen across Green Street, one cannot help but wonder if the knocking has truly stopped, or if it is merely waiting for the next family to listen.